And then we will get started. All right, so good afternoon. Welcome to our final session of Tuesday. It's been a good day. There's been lots of great conversations, and looking forward to having one more this afternoon. So we're going to take the next bit of time to talk about assessing student learning. And I'm going to take some time to kind of balance between talking about some characteristics of this as well as some ideas on how to do it. And so we want to kind of go through and take our time with this and hopefully give you some ideas on ways that you could do this in your class. We'll be sharing this PowerPoint out. There's a lot of different ideas on each slide, and so I'm not going to go through each of them today, but when we share it back out, you'll be able to look through them again and get some more information on them if you like. In addition, there's some links at the end that'll be in there, and instead of having to write those links down, then you'll just have this as available to you to be able to talk through that as well. So
ask a dumb question.
Go right ahead.
Does it get shared out?
I'm going to actually email this out to everybody for this one, but then we're also going to try and embed links on the webinars as well, so you can get to them from there if you go to the actual videos. But for the participants that are here right now, actually in this room at this moment, we'll actually email it out to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. All right, so I want to start out by talking about two words that get thrown around a lot. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about these, because I feel like sometimes we gloss over these and don't really talk about them. So the words are formative assessment and summative assessment. And when I'm talking about formative assessment, I'm talking about assessment that happens during the formation of learning. So it's about when students are actually doing the learning process. It helps me, when I think about it for myself, it helps when I do formative assessment, it helps me know where my students are at that exact moment. So I want to be able to know, are they getting what I'm talking about? Do I need to change what I'm doing at all in order to help them learn it better? And so it's both about the formation of learning and the formation of my future teaching is really what I should add into here as well, because it helps me, gives me feedback to know if what I'm doing is what I should be doing, or if I need to say it in a different way, or help them figure out a different technique to get there. So formative learning usually is smaller scale. There's smaller stakes where it's not something that's a huge test. It's something that's happening along the way, and is more about giving feedback both to the learner quickly and to the professor. Summative assessment is the evaluation of learning at the end of a unit, and that unit could be a module, it could be at the end of the course, it could be whatever that unit is that you are thinking about. These are usually larger stakes things, don't have to be, but they're usually larger stakes tests and are more about showing that you learned it than about helping along the way. And so when we're talking about these two, they have not very different, but they have different purposes. And so I like to focus more on formative assessment, because I want to make sure the students are getting it along the way and helping those students that might be falling behind. So just want to kind of have those two words out there. A lot of the assessment techniques we're going to talk about today and everything goes for both of these, but we'll talk back and forth about which makes more sense for formative versus summative as well. So what I'd like to do then is kind of talk through some different characteristics of assessment when we're talking about this, and thinking about how these can help us both build assessments and think about assessments in different ways. So assessment really should be connected into your course goals and objectives. What is it that my students want to get out of this course? What is it that I want my students to get out of this course? And how can I find out if they are getting there? And again, we can do this both in formative and summative ways. I can do it along the way to make sure they're getting it, and I can make sure at the end, yes, they did get it, or they didn't get it by the end of the course. And so the more clear I can be on the goals and objectives and really think about them as outcomes, what do I want those students to do when they are finished with this? That can help me then build in the type of assessments that I want to be able to do. So if I want them to be able to recall information or understand information, then I'm going to probably build my assessments differently than if I want them to be doing some problem solving around specific things or applying this in different ways. So that's it's it's really important, I think, to start with where do I want them to end up, and then we can work back to the assessments, and then how can I get them to those assessments. And then along the way, how can I check in to make sure they're understanding the information in a way where when we get to the end, they'll be in the place that I want them to be in. So I want to kind of go through, there's a really good website, and I'll give you the link to it at the end, that kind of breaks down some different ways of doing these. So I was going to go through each one of these and just kind of talk through a couple ideas for different ways to do these before we go on to some more characteristics. But I want to give you some ideas that you can think about. And if possible, think about one or two that you might be able to use in your classroom. I'm going to talk through some of these quickly just to kind of give you an ideas of how you could do it. And if there's ones you're interested in, I'll give you the links where there's more information about them. Okay. So in this one, if we're just trying to check recall understanding, we can do things like an empty outline, where I like this one where you give it to them after the fact, not during the class. So it's not something that you give them where they can fill out as you're going, but you give it to them afterwards and say, okay, now that we've done this, could you fill out this outline on your own? Have them fill it out and then see if their understanding matches what you think. And so I like that because it takes this idea of the empty outline that people hand out at the beginning of class and give it to them at the end and say, okay, let's see if you can come back to this now that you've taken your own notes on it. You can do things like a minute paper where at the end of class you can have 1, 2, or 3 minutes where you can ask a question like, what was the most important thing you've learned? What questions do you have remaining? But all you want it to be short and quick and concise to figure out what they're really got out of the class. I've done these before. I call it ticket out the door, where they have to write something down and hand it to me, or write something down digitally and turn it in, so I can look over this and kind of see what I need to touch base on in the next class as I get started. I've moved more towards this last one, which is muddiest point, where I can say what thing is muddiest to you right now. And for some reason, that in my classes recently, my students have responded better to that than what questions they might have or what's the most important thing you've learned. They've responded better to trying to think about what they don't get yet or why something doesn't make sense. And so I've found that that's worked well for me to get my students more interactive, just on what's their knowledge, understanding, and recall. And again, I'm gonna go through a bunch of these and then we can kind of pause and talk about them. If I'm thinking about trying to get my students more into analyzing and critical thinking, I can do things like a categorization grid, where I give students certain things and I want them to put them into different categories. So we're just thinking about things from a different place. Pro and con grid is another one that's really good, where you can have them talk about an issue and say, what are the pros of doing it this way? What are the cons of doing it this way? And having them fill out that information, not you doing it. So they can think about it and analyze a little bit more. And the defining features matrix is the other one, where you can have them as, is this something that that is there or isn't there? And talk about it from a presence or absence standpoint. And again, all of these would be the students filling them out, not doing it during class presentation where you're filling it out, but actually giving this out to students and making them do it, so you can kind of see what they're getting and if they're understanding the concepts that you want them to. If I'm thinking more about synthesis, then I can do things like a word journal, which I like, where first thing they have to do is take just one word to summarize what they think, whatever the context is, and then they write one or two paragraphs about why they chose that word. So really makes them synthesize it clearly with the word, but then lets them expand on that from there. And so it makes them think about it as concisely as possible, but then also take a step back and talk about why they chose that word. And so I like that one. The approximate analogies is one I'm thinking about trying to use this semester in my class, but I haven't yet, where you give them the first half of an analogy and then make them complete it. And so things like, I'm thinking about it in my music class. A dominant seventh chord can be compared to what, or is like a what, and have them try to think about different examples that could come out from what they're doing to finish those analogies. And then the last one here, some of you might be using is portfolios, where you're asking them to take some of their work and pull it together and then talk about why those things are important. And be able to think about how the examples that they chose would be important from that class and what they're doing. I've got one more of these. And I want to pause and kind of hear from you on things on ways you might be doing some of these as well. This one's on problem solving, and if you're having students want to get more into problem solving and focus on that as your objectives, is you provide a few problems and then ask them to figure out what type of problem they represent or what type of concept they represent in the class. And so it's about them thinking about it and looking at it in a different way. Same with what's the principle is similar, where you provide the problems instead and ask them to figure out the principle. Or the last one's the one I like, is having them actually keep track of how they solve a problem. So once you give a problem, it's not just about them figuring it out, but having them talk about how they solve that problem and thinking about that out loud, and having them think through some of that. So those are some to just kind of talk about quickly, and I'd like to take a second to pause and kind of hear from you if there's either ones you found that work really well in your classroom that are more, as you notice, most of these are more formative. They're more about how can I get my students to engage with the content in a certain way. Or would like to take a second to either hear if you have any questions at this point, or if you have certain things you've done that have really been good to get students engaged in a way where you can figure out what they're doing in the classroom, if they're getting it in the classroom. Yeah, Barbara, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, are you asking them to do this, like I teach synchronously, are you asking them to do this in the course of a class, or are you asking them to do it like in a discussion board?
I've done with the ones I've done it both ways. There's certain things I do in my class all the time. I actually, I have a smaller class, so I actually have my students, I have them get I forget I got that on. I have them actually write on a piece of, what is this? A paper sheet protector with a dry erase marker and hold it up to their camera during class all the time as a way to be able to engage with them. And so I'll ask them something and I'll actually have them write on that and then hold it up. And so I found that was my quick, easy, non-high technology way of doing this so that I could get some feedback in class. Sometimes I've had them chat during class to give feedback as well on some of the things that they've done. And some of these I've done in small groups where I've had them go off and work on it and do it on their own. Then there's other times where I'm like, this is not something I want to do in class. I'd rather do it outside of class. And I have had them do it in discussion boards or other places. So I really think it depends on what is it that you want to do in class. And we'll talk about feedback a little bit, but there's certain things I want them to get feedback from me right away. And if it's something I want them to get feedback from me right away, then that's something we're going to do in class, because I want to be like, oh, you've missed this inside of what you're doing, or oh, you need to work on this. And so that's what I think about is, do I want them to have immediate feedback, or is it something I want them to think about more and maybe gives me some time to think about the feedback I want to give them as well.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else right now? You have questions or techniques that you use that you have found that worked really well?
Of course, in an applied studio course, we do a lot of looking at drawings together and giving each other feedback, looking at first proofs together, and then looking at final. And then having that rhythm of 2 check-ins before something is done is kind of what I've been trying to work with. I'm going to try the online portfolios for the first time, but it's interesting to me that you're thinking of them almost like a mini exhibition of their formative work, whereas I'm thinking of adding it as like all the in-process stuff too. Because then I can see them working through it. Like I can see when you didn't gather materials, because there's no like, bunch of images before you started this. Where did you do your visual research,
And I love that, because you're thinking about it more from along the way, right? This is not something at the end, but I want to see the steps as you're doing them so that I can make sure you've got them, you're not missing anything.
Right, so that you're doing the steps.
Yeah. I'll be excited to hear how it goes, Ria, with your portfolios this semester.
Yeah, I'm excited too.
Okay, I'm going to move on then. So the next thing I want to talk about is feedback to students. That should be a part of this too. Assessing student learning is as much about them getting feedback as what's going on as it is about you getting the information as well. And so the first thing I would say about feedback is feedback should be done to help students know how they are getting to moving towards the course goals and objectives. And so the thing I keep thinking about and trying to figure out is how can I help my students know that they're moving towards those outcomes that I want them to? Because it's one thing to like just give them a grade, but that doesn't, if I get an 80, does that mean I've got the concepts well enough that I'm getting towards the goals that you want me to have by the end of this class? Or is there feedback that they need to have in order to be able to continue to do things? So the example I have that I do for my classes, I have a big project that we work towards at the end of the semester. They have to write a big composition, a musical composition, and we work on it over the course of the semester. And I want them to use the concepts that we are learning in class to be able to do that. So this kind of goes to what you're talking about, Ria, where the first thing I do is have them do something small with it. I want to make sure they've got that part before going to the next part, before going to the next part. And so for me, the feedback that I give is meaningful to the students because they know they need that in order to get to where they're going for the end of the semester. And so for me, it's important that the feedback I give them, they get so that by the end of the semester, they have what they need to really complete this big project that there's no way they can do. When we talk about the beginning of the semester, they all look very overwhelmed by it. And so I feel like it's very important to give them that feedback so that they know that by the end of the semester, they'll be able to do this. And so that's been helpful to me to think about if I want them to do here, how do I get them along the way to get there? And what's the feedback they need to know so that they know by the end of the semester they'll have that they need. And just curious, does anybody do anything where they give feedback in a way, either grades or written feedback or any other type of feedback that they give to help students know where they are in the course to get to what they're doing? Yeah, Barbara, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a paper that they do, and so it's composed of 3 parts. And the first part is they have to find a company that's in the Fortune 100 that's been in the news so that they can't borrow it from people in previous semesters. And then what I do is we go to the library and we do some library research with Michelle Henley, and she talks about some stuff. And then they have to take a theory that we use and explain ultimately where it's going. And then the third part is they have to work a model that says, how would you solve a company's problem using the theory? So they first have to hand in a summary of what they think based on some articles is the company's issue. And then they have to, and we go around the room and we talk about it because a lot of times they have some issues together. And then I have workshops that are separate and they're not mandatory. And we actually go back and forth and say, well, here's where I think you're going. Here's how it's going. And that seems to help. And then they have an outline that's due about a month before the project so that we talk about it again. Oops, I think you're a little offline. Here's where it's going. And then they do the paper. So by the time we get to the end of the paper, which is worth only 15% of their grade, they really have a stronger sense of where it's going. And the feedback I've gotten from students is that when they go back into the world of work, it's like, oh, right, this is kind of like what we did in class.
Nice. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are you still able to see my presentation right now?
Yes.
I have like a spinning wheel on it, so I didn't know if it stopped or something.
Nope,
okay.
It's good.
Okay. Thanks. Anybody else? I'm just kind of curious how people do this. Are there ways that you help your students know how to help your students know how they're moving towards the course objectives that you have in any way that you do that? Okay. Then the other part of feedback that I want to talk about is making sure that the feedback that they get is timely and regular. It's really easy to have tests, they get the score back, and that's it. And they can say, yes, I got an 80 out of 100 on this grade, or I got a 20 out of 30 on this, or whatever. But the feedback is what's really important for students to be able to know if they're getting if they're getting the concepts and if they're understanding it correctly, so that when they go to study for it, they're doing what they need to be doing. And I talked about this earlier. One of the ways I try to do feedback is I actually have them hold up stuff in class, but that's because I have a small class. I can do that. If I had a class of 50 students, I couldn't have them hold something up in front of there and be able to see everybody quickly. And so it's this balancing act of how do you get the students to give you the information and hold them accountable for the information, which is some of the stuff we talked about yesterday in some of the other sessions. And then also get in a way where you can give feedback to them. This is where I like things like polling software that's out there, whether it's the polling inside of inside of Teams, or like I use Socrative as another one that I've used in the past, where I have students answer questions in a way where I can see who's answered what, and also I can see overall, okay, 30% of the people answered correctly on this. And so I found polling software is a really great thing to do, especially in class, where I can ask questions and have them answer right away. And then I can give feedback right away on that in class as we're going along. I like personally feedback that happens synchronously because it feels like it creates more of a conversation as we're going through this. But there's also the feedback on if you're asking them to do discussion board posts or on papers or anything else, what's the feedback that we can give that's meaningful to them in a way that works for them. I've always struggled with having presentations at the end of the class where they do great and I put all this feedback on, but by that point at the end of the class, the feedback I give them is not going to be that meaningful because most of the time they don't read it, right? They're like, I've got my grade in the class, I'm done with this class now, I'm moving on. So I've tried to actually front load feedback in my class more. So by the time we get to the final project, I don't give a lot of feedback on a final project unless somebody comes to me and says, I'd really like to get more feedback on this. So I've really focused more on giving lots of feedback early on in the semester and up until through the 2/3 of the way through semester. So by the end of the semester, they really know what's expected of them and should have a pretty good concept of what's going to be needed for the end of the semester. For one, it's helped me at the end of the semester then with my grading and turnaround because then I'm not having to provide a ton of feedback then. But also then I feel like the feedback that I do give is more meaningful because it really will impact the learner that they have in the class that I have. Now, again, the level of feedback that you can give is dependent on the size of your classes and how much you're able to do with that. But I feel it's important to really give them as much feedback as possible, especially early on, to be able to help them with their own learning and become more aware of what needs to happen in your class.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this in my own class, understanding the question better now, is that I'm always responding each project, what are the technical, formal, and conceptual considerations? How are they working? So that there's this repetition in each project of what the expectations are. You have technical aspects, you have formal design aspects, and then you've got conceptual aspects that you need to respond to. So make sure you've gone through and thought about all three each time, because we're going to do it again at the drawing, at the proof, and at the final stage, so that we really that gets repeated. And so, yeah, exactly. My final project, we talk about them, but I don't give a lot of formal feedback because we've been talking about this all semester.
Anybody else? What are ways that you try to give feedback in your classes, or what techniques that you found that have worked for giving feedback to students? And Kim, thanks for the comment. Yeah, I think that's, repetition especially, I think is very helpful because it really helps students know what is expected of them in that.
Yeah. I mean, I can say for mine, sorry, my camera's not quite on yet. There we go. That for mine, I think the thing I give the most feedback on is probably like lab reports, because, science lab reports. We didn't do as much this past semester because obviously it was all chaos and all online labs and a whole bunch of stuff. But generally when I do that, I like to have a rubric, and that way they see the rubric, I see the rubric, and it's more just like for them, it's a checklist of like, what is she looking for in a paper? But it also does like what Ria's talking about, where it sort of establishes this is what should be in a paper. Like what should be in a paper for science is the experimental, and it should be this certain way, and this is what people are always going to look for, and this is like how results in discussion. These are the things I look for. And I used to do it just like every specific thing. And I found when I made it more general, so it wasn't like talk about cinnamon and how it does the certain thing. It was like talk about the discussion questions. Those are the specifics, but talk about like, just talk about what you made, talk about how you know what you made, talk about how it relates to the literature. Like those things really made them see every time, like, oh, by like the third or fourth paper, people are like, so I'm just going to do this again. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, oh, that's all it is. Otherwise, they were just like checking through everything I said every time, but they didn't realize that there was a pattern. So it was like making it a little bit broader, but then like showing them like each time, like, it's just what you made. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I think that's a good strategy. And having a rubric is always nice. I think it's easier for me to grade. It's easier for them to see what's going on. But I found that like I was putting all these comments before and they were just not looking at them. And I'd get to the end of the semester and I'd have students who were like, wait, you have comments? And I was like, I have been spending hours typing all these comments. And like, so I was like, yeah, basically I start off writing lots of comments and then I just sort of black off. And then if someone's like, oh, I want more comments, I'm like, sure. But if not, I'm just like, if you don't know it by the fourth time, you probably haven't been reading this the whole time. So that's the other thing. So I write comments, but I try to like, pare it back as we go and focus more on the rubric. And I think that helps.
Yeah.
So that's for me.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, one thing I'm always thinking about especially with feedback is when you do it, it takes a lot of time. And so I'm conscious of what's the balance of giving enough feedback and not overworking people that are already working a ton, especially right now with the switching modalities when you're doing everything else. There was somebody once said, I want my students to do a lot of work, but the assessment should be just a synthesis of what they've done. So instead of trying to make everybody show you all of their work, that assessment of it, whatever it is you want them to show you, they should have to synthesize that somehow, so it boils it down just to the essence of what you want and makes that less for you to read and easier for you to give feedback on. One thing I've done too some recently is, I'll read everything, but I won't, as long as you turn it in, you get the 3 points for turning in something at the end of class. I read those to be like, oh yeah, they got it. Oh no, they didn't get it. So it gives me feedback, but I don't grade that individually like, oh, you get a 2.5 out of 3, or you get a 1.5. It's just you did it. Thank you. I get the feedback and then we can move on with it. And so there's that balancing act of what's enough feedback, but also what's too much so you can keep your sanity. And I really want to make sure we keep our sanity when we move through these semesters if possible. And I'm kicking myself. I can't believe this. I don't think I put in a slide on here about rubrics specifically. It's kind of covered in some other stuff we're going to talk about. But rubrics is a really great way to show what's being expected of students. And we're actually going to talk about it kind of on another slide, but I don't think I said anything specifically in here about rubrics. And thank you, Kim, for bringing those up, because it's I know some people are very hesitant on them because they feel like it is just a checklist and that it makes it easy for them to go through. But there are great ways to write rubrics where you can say, here's the expectations for you. You still have a lot of flexibility in here. And Kim, as you said, like, it doesn't have to be really specific. You can keep them generalized. But what I like about them both is it gets it generalized, but I can also build in the feedback that I want to give for different levels. So I'm not having to write the same stuff multiple times. I can just say, you got a 5 out of 5 on this because, yes, you did fill in all of the information that you needed to, and you did synthesize it really well. Oh, you get a 3 out of 5 because you didn't synthesize as well as somebody else did. And so I can give a lot of feedback just by clicking on the box of the rubric to be able to help the students get the feedback that they need. But without me having to do, a ton of effort as I'm grading it. What I have found with rubrics is I'm constantly changing them each semester when I use it. The first time it's kind of bare bones, and I'm like, oh, I'm writing this feedback a lot. That should go in here on the rubric, and I just add it into the rubric. So the next time I get it, I have that feedback in there now that can help me give the information I want to my students.
And can I just add to that real quick? So I like to do that too. And then also Blackboard can do that. So just FYI, Blackboard can do that. I did everything on turnitin.com when I first started. That's how long I've been doing that stuff. And you could like just take the comments and drag them. And that was so nice that you could just make a comment that said like, unclear. And then like they could click on it and it would say more stuff. So you can't do that on Blackboard, but I just have a sheet on the side where I just like type a comment I say a lot. And then I just cut and paste it in there. And then that way I don't have to keep typing it a lot. But then also you can have the rubric just be like click, 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 click,
Yeah.
and then they can see like the specific things. And I like that too. So, and you can break it down. Like I break mine down by sections because the things are different. But you can do it however you want. So if anyone's doing it and it's like, that's such a pain, it's like, well, it's at least a little bit easier in Blackboard. And if Blackboard makes something easy, you should take advantage because that's not always the case.
We're actually going to do a session on how to build rabbits. Wow.
Awesome.
On how to build rubrics in Blackboard. I can't remember if that's tomorrow or Thursday, but we are going to do a session on that. And Kim, there actually is a new feature now where you can create a library of comments and you can pull those comments out and put them in.
My dream. It's only been 12 years since turnitin.com did it. Good job, Blackboard.
Yes. Oh, and actually Diana just put in another cool tool that she found called, it's called Dashboard. But it allows you to do basically what you were just saying as well, where you can build comments and then copy them in different places.
It's actually called Blaze, B-L-A-Z-E. It's a pro plugin, so you can use it with any web application, including Blackboard. I like it a lot.
So Blaze is the name of it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So that's a tool. And then inside of Blackboard, when you're doing assignments, you can actually create a library of comments that you can pull from whenever you want to and throw them onto the page. And so thanks, Ria. That's tomorrow. We'll be talking about rubrics and how you can actually build those inside of Blackboard and be able to use those. Other thoughts, questions right now before we? Okay, then the next thing I want to talk about is starting to help students learn how to assess their own learning. And there's really two parts to this. One is thinking about themselves as a learner and how what the class that they're in fits into that. And so what are ways we can help them kind of think about their own learning? And so these are some ideas for that. And to be honest, this is one area that I've not been good at, and I'm trying to figure out better ways to do this with my classes. I do make them do the first one. The first day class, I actually make them do I call it a resume for me, but I should call it an autobiographical sketch instead. But it's, ask them questions about who they are, what they do outside of class. I teach a music class. I want to know what type of music they listen to and if they play instruments, but also why are they excited about taking this class, or why are they interested in taking this class? How does this fit into their overall goals while they're in college? So doing an autobiographical sketch I've found is a good way for me to get to know them, but also for them, I want to do better about having them situate the class that they're taking with me into their overall learning in the college, which I haven't done in the past. I think I'm going to add in this year, actually. Then you can do things like, interest, skills, and checklists where you're like, yes, these are things that I'm interested in. So they can show that to you, but also so they can start to think about it themselves. They can do goal ranking where they list a few of their own goals and then rank their relative importance and share those with you. Again, that helps you understand who they are as a learner, but also helps them kind of situate what's the most important things for them. And just think about different ways that they can think about themselves as a learner, and how that class that they are taking with you fits into that is something that I'm excited about trying to explore more and think about. And I'm just, before I move on to the next one, I'm just curious, does anybody do anything like this already in their classes where they have their students think about their own learning and how the things that are going on in your class fit into that?
I do a first sort of, what are your goals and purposes, and what are you looking to get out of this course question, and then what kind of challenges do you think you're going to have? How do you think you can respond, rise to those challenges? And then at the end, we kind of go back and look at them and say, where did we get? There's a writing at the end as well.
So they take that same information for the beginning of the semester and use it again at the end of the semester?
Some similar prompts. I mean, sort of in response, how did you respond? You know, were the challenges the ones you expected, and how did you respond to them, and how successful was that, and did you get where you want to go, and those sorts of questions. So
Nice.
I'm really interested in the self-assessment ways of learning, but giving students, you know, we all do that. It's like, well, I'm a visual learner, I'm an artist. It's like, wait, it's much more complicated than that. I mean, some profiles or approaches, like a list of 8 or 9 of them would be great to help them think. How do we get a hold of that?
I will look into it. Well, yeah, we will look into it. I'll say we, so that I can.
Yeah, me too.
That conversation.
Because that would be really helpful in terms of helping sort of prompt their own thinking, you know, about how different ways people learn.
Right.
That would be really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Barbara, I saw you had your hand raised.
Yep. I do 2 kinds of things. One is when we're first in the classroom, because so much of this stuff that I'm going to talk about is experiential. So I go around and I ask them, where are you from? And of course, then if they tell me they're from Poughkeepsie, I tell them not to go to Barnes and Noble because that's where I hang out. Like we established that rapport early on. But then, you know, so then I ask them, you know, what kinds of things. And the rule in my class is we don't mention the companies you ever worked for, so that we can be pretty open about different situations. And then I have a questionnaire that's at the back of my syllabus for them to hand in. And it's, you know, what have you done work-wise? What have you done volunteer? What do you want to get out of this class? You know, besides I have to take it because it's a required class garbage.
Mm-hmm.
And that's and I tell them that I use it to tailor some of the pieces, but it also helps me if you have a particular awareness of music, for example. I'm gonna try to pull that out of you and have you share that with everybody else if it's relevant to what we're going to talk about.
Nice. Thanks. And Judith, I see you have your hand raised as well.
Yes, I'm teaching a mini, and I start off with, and it's also an area that's not really my area. It's about taking tests and that's that sort of stuff. And I start off with a journal entry on where the students do this sort of autobiographical thing, where they assess themselves as students right now. And they can also talk, and they talk about what kinds of students they've been up until now. So, and then at the same time, there's a mindfulness unit. So every week they are also writing, they're doing a piece of mindfulness writing in the anticipation, or in my hope, that they really get to know where they are and who they are. So, and it's that's been quite effective.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thanks. And Kim, I love the questions that you have of at the midterm, you ask them what's going well, what's challenging, and what can you as the student do to help with that, right? And then what can I as the teacher help to change that? And I would guess that would be effective for both of them. I don't know if you want to chime in on that.
Well, and also it's nice because it helps with evaluations at the end, because then they'll say the things that they would say at the end, and I'll be like, so some people said this, here's why we're not going to do that. Because sometimes you have to say that. Like sometimes there's good ideas and I'm like, yeah, I can do that. And sometimes I'm like, I see what you're saying, but we have to have tests, like those kinds of things. Like, here's why we can't work in groups for our tests, like that kind of stuff. And that way they just don't say it at the end because they're like, oh, she heard what I said and she like, so I feel like I've been heard, but also now I kind of understand and I won't say that again. So I think that's good also because it just gives you that rapport of like, oh, we're in this together. You're not just like trying to fight me. And it's like, no, I'm not. I don't want to. Let's just like, I don't know. It makes a better rapport if you do that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of research that shows that, especially at midterms, if you do that, like just allowing students to feel like they've been heard, it means a lot to them. And so it can be really helpful just with the rapport of the classroom and the environment of the classroom, and they feel like there's a chance for them to get feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. Thanks. The last point I wanted to talk about with us was we've talked about helping students assess their own learning, but we also want to get to the point where we can help students assess their own work. And how do we get them to do self-assessment on what they're doing? And so this slide, it comes from a different place, but this one I liked because it condensed it really well of 3 places of. First one is seeing some examples of what it looks like when things go well. So what does a good piece of music look like if you do it well? What does a good painting look like if you do it well? What does a good composition look like if you do it well? What does a good paragraph look like? What does a good lab report look like? And helping them see some exemplars of that can be good, whether that's the actual one or we can build rubrics around that to say these are the things that would be inside of that. And so helping them know that is really important. And then the second part, and this goes back to what Rhea was talking about earlier, was helping them build the vocabulary specific to that craft to be able to give the feedback that you want to give. It is a challenging thing to say beyond I like this or I don't like this. Why? Unless students know the vocabulary they need to be able to do it. And so in order for them to be really true self-assess themselves, they need to know the vocabulary around your discipline to be able to say that. So for me, I want students to know if they are balancing phrase structures and being able to put in cadences in the correct places. And so I need to be able to talk about that language in a way where it's not just about me using it, but helping them practice using it in ways that are helpful. And so it's not just about me saying, oh, you should have this and here's why, but they need to actually have a chance to practice it. And I haven't done this a lot yet, so I'd be curious to hear from others, but from the reading on it is, it's good to do this with your peers first before it is on yourself. And so practicing peer critique is actually a better way to do this before you start assessing your own stuff. So thinking about how I can have my students practice critiquing other people and using the language that I want them to use for that. So it's not just I like this or I don't like this or this is horrible, this is good, but helping them find the language to be able to do this in a way that's meaningful both to them and to the other people is very important. And Rhea actually does this really well. So I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit, Rhea, because I think you have great examples of this, but especially how you use terminology around the critiques that you use, but would love to have you share some of that if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, as long as if I go off in the wrong direction, let me know. So we have technical, formal, and conceptual aspects to anything that's made. So it's the techniques that you used and how did you use them, the design aspects, use of the elements and principles of design, line, shape, color, and then the formal, like what you're communicating, the conceptual, the ideas. So those are the 3 things we want to talk about. And then I have my students respond to each other's work. First, something that's working specifically in one of those areas. I think this is a really strong design because it is a clear focal point with repetition and variation. It's good is never acceptable. Tell me why. In which area? It was really cleanly printed. The borders are clean. It's properly annotated. It looks really professional. Okay, that's cool. That's good feedback. And then the second question is, if this were yours, what would you play with to improve it, change it, or try to see where it would go? So really taking the onus off of, I think you should do this, but no, if this were mine, I would darken these values so that area sets back in space more strongly and I get a sense of depth. That's useful information. So I try to be really clear in the structure of my comments. This is what I would do and why. This is the area that I'm talking about, technical, formal, conceptual. And if I do it right, we can kind of get the wheels rolling, and then, pretty much by midterm, it's a pretty good discussion. It's a little work at the beginning.
And thanks for sharing that. What I like about that is you create the wording where it's safe, and it's not something that is meant to be mean to the other person, but constructive for the other person. So to create that language of saying, if it was mine, I would do it this way, gives the feedback that you want to that student, but in a way where it's not presented in a negative light, but in a positive light.
Yeah, and it's I forgot what I was going to say, but it's if it were mine, this is what I would do. also says there's lots of options, because somebody else might come back with, well, if it were mine, I would do this for these reasons. So you get yet another option. You know, kind of depends on your, and it helps them think about their priorities when they're creating something.
Yeah, and so you know, one of the deep dives I like to do at some point is how do we create those safe spaces to create, like, what are the different ways we could say those things in a lot of different disciplines to be able to say, if this was mine, I would do it this way. That's, you know, again, one of the things I'm thinking about doing this semester is actually have my students meet up with another person, getting feedback from each other on what sounds good and doesn't in their compositions they're going to be working on my class. And so I might actually be using some of the same wording that Ria has talked about here to find, to help me be able to have the students give feedback to each other in a way that's meaningful, and talk about the terminology of my class, but using a way where they can give it to each other, give that information to each other, with the idea that by the end of the semester, they should be able to critique their own compositions, their own projects in that same way, and think about their own stuff in that way. If that's, for me, I think that's the ultimate goal with that, is how do we get them to do it with others so they can practice there, but then also start to think about it on their own stuff, which sometimes is harder to do because it's your own work that you've been doing all semester long or your whole life. And so I think it's a little safer to give some of those critiques externally first before we do it internally.
Another thing that I've had done with folks, I saw a professor at the University of Connecticut who I really admired enormously, is she would talk about a student's work and say, when I'm looking at this, these are the things that I'm noticing. And so she describes their work back to them, teaching vocabulary, and they often then see things in a different way. So you can do that with musical composition as well, or when I read this composition, this is what I'm getting out of it, like summarizing it in a way that allows them to see it differently, and that can be really valuable in helping them learn how to do that as well for each other. Not just what I would do, but this is what I'm getting. This is the theme I'm getting out. You've shown me 3 prints, and I'm really getting this surrealist vibe. And you're working with dreams. And a person was like, "Wow, I thought I was working representationally." You know, like, you know. But because then it's just like, this is what I'm seeing. It's about me, what I'm getting from this. It's not about what you're doing, and yet it gives them a new perspective.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Any other ways that people do this with having students do either peer assessment or self-assessment of their own work? Does anybody do anything like this in their classes right now? It's always been something that I know I need to do more of. It's always been on my radar to do in my own classes more of, but I always feel a little uncomfortable doing, because it can be an uncomfortable thing to have to give a critique of somebody else, and especially when you don't know the language very well and you don't know the language of the department or the discipline, and so I think it always makes me a little uncomfortable to have to make students do that, and so I'm still trying to figure out the best way to do that in the language of that, and so that's where I'm appreciative to others that are sharing with that. Yeah, and Betty, thank you for that comment in there. I agree with you that we need, like, when there are times where I'm like, oh no, you don't have this concept right? We need to be able to correct somebody. So when they're talking about whatever concept and they're using it inappropriate, they're using it in the wrong context, the wrong way, I need to let them know, oh no, that's not what that means, or that means something different. And so I agree with you. Like, that's part of this growing experience, is learning how to use the vocabulary in the right way, and helping steer them in that. And so that feedback can be very important to them, both from I don't have this concept right, I need to know to get it right for moving forward. And again, that's where I feel like that feedback is really important on a regular basis, where they get a chance to always get a chance to do it. And Julie, you're right, the more regularly you do it, the more comfortable the students get, and the more comfortable I get with it too. I just have to break the seal on it because I haven't been comfortable with it yet. So we'll talk about where the recordings are in a second, but yeah, Kim, thanks for putting that in there. Yeah. And so Michael is talking about peer critiques on research methods, and when you're using the same thing over and over again, and I think that's where it comes back to. I want to focus this, and this comes back full circle for me, back to what are my course objectives for this course. If my objectives are that I want them to be able to do X, Y, and Z, that's the terminology I should be focusing on throughout the semester to get them to that point, right? So the more we can be iterative and keep coming back to this, the better off it's going to be. The word we use a lot is scaffolding. You slowly build up the scaffold around this, so by the time you can be way up here on the scaffolding. But we want to scaffold as we go along to help them support them, so that by the time they get to the end, they can do the things, the course objectives that we want them to. And so those assessments become really important along the way to help us know, are they getting there? Are they using the right terminology? Are they doing it in the right and the wrong way? And so helping them use that language as much as possible, whatever that critique is or whatever that information that you want them to get, that becomes really important. So thanks. So here's some of the places I got information from, and again, I'll share this out with everybody so you can actually have these links if you want to go look at them and be able to explore them more. And we do have a website that we keep. I don't actually have the website here. I'll pull that up real quick. But we have a website that we maintain that has all the links to the recordings on them. So that's right here. It'll come out in just a second in the chat. There you go. And from there, you can get to all of our webinar recordings, both this one and all of our other ones. This link to the playlist of all of our webinars is on the site that I just put into the chat as well. So you can see that. We're going to be continuing doing webinars all of this week to help get ready for the semester. And then we're starting to plan out our spring semester trainings, both us and the Faculty Center together, to be able to give lots of additional opportunities to talk about these things. We're going to be doing a teaching breakfast on Thursday morning this week. We're going to start teaching breakfast back up so we can continue to have conversations around this, and look forward to talking to you as much as possible throughout all of this. Yeah, go ahead.
And we're going to be doing, to expand the teaching breakfast time, we're going to be doing a coffee hour on Wednesdays from 2 to 3. Same format as teaching breakfast, just trying to catch other folks who can't make it on Thursday mornings.
Regularly.
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. So
We'll
that's Wednesday.
2 to 3.
Yep, so a coffee chat from 2 to 3 or teaching breakfast from 8:30 to 10. Whenever you can come in any of those, it'll be the same topics of conversation each week. It'll just give more people a chance to come if they can make it.
And would we get in the same way?
Yes. Yep. We'll use the same link for both the coffee hour and the teaching breakfast.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll have the same article links, so it'll all, yeah. And you can come to both and keep right on going.
That's great.
So I'm going to stop the recording.